There are moments when a person does not walk away because they stopped caring, but because they became terrified of what they believed caring would cost them. And somewhere behind a closed door, someone has been carrying that kind of fear while pretending it was certainty. They heard a story about your family. They were told there was something dark in your history, something inherited, something that could follow anyone who came too close. At first, they laughed it off. Then someone showed them something they could not easily explain. And that was the moment their attitude toward you began to change. You remember the difference, even if you never understood it. Their messages became shorter. Their eyes stopped meeting yours for as long as they used to. A warmth that once felt natural suddenly seemed replaced by caution. You may have wondered whether you had said something wrong, whether someone had poisoned their opinion of you, or whether they had simply decided you were no longer worth the effort. But the truth inside this fictional story is far more complicated. They were not responding to something you had done. They were reacting to something they had been told. And what they were told came wrapped in an old family story. It began with a conversation in a quiet room late at night. The person who warned them did not raise their voice. They did not need to. They spoke softly, almost as though they were sharing a secret that had been protected for generations. They described a supposed family curse, a pattern of loss, broken relationships, sudden departures, and people who seemed to disappear from one another's lives without explanation. Then came the sentence that changed everything. You need to be careful who you get attached to. The person you care about sat there silently, staring at the table. They wanted to dismiss it. They really did. But then the storyteller mentioned details they thought nobody else knew. That was what made the warning feel real. Suddenly, old memories began rearranging themselves inside their mind. A difficult season in your family. A relationship that ended strangely. A relative who left without explanation. A painful event nobody liked discussing. Pieces that had once seemed unrelated were suddenly being connected into one frightening pattern. And instead of asking whether the pattern was actually true, they began asking a more painful question. What if I am next? That question followed them everywhere. It followed them when they passed your name on their phone. It followed them when they remembered the sound of your laughter. It followed them when they almost reached out and then stopped themselves. And the cruelest part was that they began confusing fear with intuition. They convinced themselves that turning away from you was wisdom. They called it protection. They called it being careful. But somewhere underneath all those explanations was a heart that still did not want to let you go. Then something unexpected happened. They found an old box. It was tucked away in a place that had not been opened for years, buried beneath photographs, letters, receipts, and forgotten keepsakes. They were not searching for answers about you. They were looking for something completely unrelated. But when the box shifted, a thin envelope slid from underneath it and landed on the floor. There was no dramatic music. No thunder. No mysterious voice. Just the soft sound of paper touching wood. And yet, when they picked it up, something about the handwriting made them stop. They recognized the name. It belonged to someone from your family. Their hands became still. They opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written decades earlier. At first, the words seemed ordinary. There was mention of hardship, a difficult season, and a family trying to survive circumstances they did not understand. But then they reached a paragraph that made their breathing change. The letter did not describe a curse. It described a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that had been repeated so many times that eventually people stopped questioning it. The person read the paragraph again. Then again. And suddenly, the story they had been told began to crack. Because the supposed curse had a beginning. And that beginning was not supernatural. It was human. Someone had made a terrible decision during a time of desperation. Someone else had misunderstood what happened. Then another person repeated the story years later, adding details that had never been there. Eventually, the warning became family folklore. The folklore became a belief. And the belief became a reason to fear people connected to your bloodline. But there was still something missing. Why had so many painful events happened afterward? That question kept them reading. The letter explained that the family had not been cursed. They had been repeating the same patterns. People hid problems instead of discussing them. They stayed silent when they were hurt. They allowed suspicion to replace conversation. They made decisions from fear and then interpreted the consequences as proof that the fear had been justified. The tragedy was not that some invisible force had followed them. The tragedy was that frightened people had unknowingly taught the next generation to expect something terrible. And once you expect abandonment, you sometimes create distance before anyone has the chance to leave. Once you expect betrayal, you begin searching for evidence of it. Once you believe love carries danger, you may destroy the very connection you secretly want to protect. The person reading the letter suddenly remembered you. Not the rumors. Not the warnings. You. The quiet moments. The conversations nobody else had witnessed. The way you had shown patience when they were difficult. The way you had listened without demanding an explanation. The moment you had encouraged them when you had no idea they were struggling. And a painful realization began to form. What if the person they had been warned about was not dangerous at all? What if the real danger had been the fear planted inside them? They closed their eyes. For the first time, they allowed themselves to consider the possibility that they had turned against the wrong person. But then the letter revealed one final detail. A detail so specific that they could not dismiss it. The writer had mentioned a person from the next generation. Someone who would one day be blamed for the family's supposed misfortune. Someone whose name would be connected to the old story. Someone who would grow up hearing whispers they never deserved. They looked down at the page. And there it was. Your name. Their heart dropped. Because suddenly this was no longer an old family story. It was about you. They read the sentence beneath your name, and everything they thought they knew began collapsing at once. The letter said that you were never supposed to carry the blame. In fact, the writer had left a warning for the person who would eventually discover the letter. A warning about what would happen if someone believed the curse instead of learning the truth. They stared at those words for a long time. Then their phone buzzed. It was you. Just one simple message. No accusation. No anger. No demand for an explanation. Only a few words asking if they were okay. And that was when the emotional weight of everything finally reached them. Because after believing that you were somehow connected to a curse, after allowing fear to turn them against you, after creating distance they could not explain, you were still thinking about whether they were okay. They put the phone down. Their eyes filled with tears. Not because they were afraid anymore. Because they were ashamed. They realized you had been standing on the other side of a wall they built from someone else's story. And now they had discovered the wall was never protecting them. It was separating them from someone who had never been their enemy. But the letter was not finished. There was one final page folded behind the envelope. They almost missed it. When they pulled it free, another name was written across the top. And beneath that name was a confession that changed the entire meaning of what they had just discovered. Because the person who originally spread the story of the family curse had not been trying to protect anyone. They had been hiding something. Something connected directly to the reason your family had suffered for so many years. And when the person you care about read the next line, they realized the truth was far more personal than they ever imagined. The supposed curse had never been about your family. It had been about a secret someone had spent decades trying to keep buried. And now, for the first time, that secret had found its way into their hands. They looked at your name again. Then they whispered the question they had been too afraid to ask before. What have I done? And on the other side of that question was a truth they were not yet ready to face. Because the person who had warned them about you was about to become the person they could no longer trust. They remained seated long after the room had gone completely quiet. The letter rested across their knees, but they were no longer reading it. Their mind had already moved somewhere deeper, somewhere memory and truth were colliding. One question kept returning: why would someone invent a story like this? They thought about the person who had warned them. The reassuring voice. The concerned expression. The careful choice of words. They remembered being told, "I'm only saying this because I care about you." At the time, those words had sounded protective. Now they sounded different. They picked up the letter again and examined the handwriting. There was something strangely deliberate about it. The writer had not simply described what happened. They had documented names, dates, and conversations. They had preserved details as though they knew someone would eventually need proof. Then they found a date. It was years before you were born. That changed everything. Because the person who had warned them had made the story sound as though the trouble began with your generation. But the letter proved otherwise. The pattern had existed long before you entered the picture. And suddenly another possibility emerged. Maybe you had never inherited a curse. Maybe you had inherited a story. A story that had been handed from one frightened person to another until nobody remembered where it began. They stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the street was almost empty. A few distant headlights moved through the darkness, disappearing around the corner one after another. The ordinary world continued as though nothing had changed. But inside that room, something had shifted permanently. They realized how easily people can mistake repetition for truth. If a story is told enough times, it begins to feel like history. If enough people believe it, questioning it can make you look foolish. And if fear is attached to the story, people may obey it without ever asking who benefits from their obedience. That thought made them turn back toward the letter. Who benefited? They searched through the remaining pages. Then they found an old photograph. It showed several members of the family standing together at an outdoor gathering. Everyone was dressed formally. Some were smiling. Others looked uncomfortable. But one person in the photograph had been marked with a small handwritten circle. They recognized the face immediately. It was the same person who had warned them about you. Their stomach tightened. The photograph was decades old. That meant the connection was not recent. There was a history here that nobody had told them. They turned the photograph over. On the back, someone had written a single sentence. He knows what really happened. Their hands began to tremble. Not from some supernatural force. From the realization that the truth had been hiding in plain sight. The person who had convinced them to distrust you had apparently known far more about the family history than they ever admitted. But why? They began searching for another explanation. Maybe the warning had been sincere. Maybe that person had also been manipulated. Maybe they had inherited the same fear and genuinely believed they were saving someone from pain. That possibility softened their anger. And that mattered. Because this was no longer a simple story about a villain and a victim. It was becoming a story about people who had been frightened for so long that they forgot how to question what frightened them. Still, there was accountability. Someone had chosen silence. Someone had allowed you to carry suspicion that never belonged to you. And someone had watched another person turn against you without revealing what they knew. The person holding the photograph suddenly understood something painful about forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean pretending nothing happened. It means refusing to let someone else's mistake determine the shape of your heart. But before they could decide what to do, they noticed something else inside the box. A small key. It was attached to a faded metal tag. There was a number written on it. They searched the old records and found a matching reference to a storage unit that had belonged to a relative who died many years earlier. Their first instinct was to put everything away. This had already become too much. But then they looked at your unanswered message. Their thumb hovered over the screen. They wanted to tell you everything. They wanted to apologize. They wanted to explain why they had pulled away. But they stopped. An apology without understanding would only be another half-truth. So instead, they decided to find out what was inside that storage unit. The next morning, they drove there alone. The sky was pale and overcast, and rain tapped softly against the windshield. With every mile, their certainty grew weaker. They had expected to find something frightening. Instead, they found something heartbreaking. The storage unit contained ordinary things. Old furniture. Children's drawings. A broken clock. Several boxes of clothing. And photographs. Hundreds of them. Life preserved in fragments. Birthdays. Graduations. Family dinners. People smiling before arguments, before separations, before years of silence. They began to understand that families rarely break in one dramatic moment. Sometimes the distance grows through dozens of small choices. One person refuses to speak. Another refuses to apologize. Someone assumes the worst. Someone else stays silent because explaining feels exhausting. Eventually, nobody remembers which wound came first. They opened another box. Inside was a collection of handwritten journal pages. The first few described ordinary life. Then the entries changed. The writer described the night when the family supposedly became cursed. There had been no supernatural event. There had been a confrontation. Money was involved. Trust was broken. And one person had threatened to expose what another family member had done. Then came the sentence that made the reader stop. The curse story was created so nobody would ask what really happened. They read it twice. Then slowly lowered the page. So that was the secret. The family had not been haunted by some invisible force. They had been haunted by an undisclosed betrayal. Someone had taken something that did not belong to them. Someone had lied about it. And when the consequences arrived, they needed another explanation. A curse was easier to believe than betrayal. A curse required no confession. A curse could be blamed on bloodlines, fate, history, anything except a human decision. But there was still another question. Why had you become connected to it? They kept reading. The answer appeared several pages later. Years after the original betrayal, someone had discovered the truth and attempted to correct the record. But before they could speak publicly, they disappeared from the family's inner circle. Their letters were hidden. Their warnings were dismissed. And their child was told never to discuss the matter again. That child eventually became the person who had warned your person about you. The realization was devastating. The person who had turned them against you had not created the story. They had inherited it. They had been raised inside it. They had been taught that certain people were dangerous without ever being told why. And now, for the first time, they were seeing how deeply that fear had shaped their life. They thought about every relationship they had sabotaged. Every opportunity they had walked away from. Every time they had searched for hidden danger when there was none. Suddenly, your presence in their life looked different. You had not awakened a curse. You had awakened a question. A question they had spent their entire life avoiding. Is this actually true? That question had frightened them more than the original story ever could. Because once someone begins questioning an inherited belief, they cannot easily return to the comfort of ignorance. They gathered the papers and placed them carefully into a folder. Then they noticed one final envelope. It was sealed. Their name was written on the front. Not your name. Theirs. They stared at it. For several seconds, they considered leaving it unopened. Then they realized something. Whoever had written it knew that one day they would find the truth. They broke the seal. Inside was a short letter. The first line read, "If you are holding this, then you have probably already hurt someone you love because of what we taught you." Their eyes filled immediately. The writer explained that the family had spent generations protecting a false explanation because the truth would force them to admit something far more uncomfortable. They had been wrong. Not once. Not accidentally. Repeatedly. They had chosen fear over honesty. They had chosen silence over reconciliation. They had called people dangerous when those people were simply different from the story they had been taught. And then came the sentence that changed everything. Do not punish the next person for what we were too afraid to confront. They read it slowly. Then they looked at your message again. This time, they answered. I need to tell you something. They paused. Deleted it. Typed again. I was wrong about you. Deleted that too. Finally, they wrote the only thing that felt honest. Can we talk? The message was sent. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Then 5. Nothing. Their heart sank. Maybe they had waited too long. Maybe you had already closed that door. Maybe the damage could not be undone simply because they had discovered the truth. And then your reply appeared. 3 words. I know already. They froze. Their face went pale. You had known? How? They immediately typed back. What do you mean? The reply came almost instantly. I found something too. They stared at the screen. Then another message appeared. There is something my family never told me about that story. A cold silence filled the room. Because suddenly they understood. The truth had not been discovered by one person. It had been uncovered from 2 different directions. You had your own piece of the story. And whatever you had found was apparently connected to the same secret. They asked what it was. The typing indicator appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Then your message arrived. I found the original document. They stopped breathing for a moment. What document? The answer came. The one that proves who started the entire story. They stared at the screen. Then another message appeared. And it has your family member's signature on it. Their hand slowly lowered the phone. The room seemed suddenly smaller. Because the person who had turned against you had finally discovered that the story was false. But you had discovered something even more dangerous to the family's carefully protected history. You had discovered who had deliberately created it. And there was one final detail neither of you understood yet. The signature on that document was not from the person they suspected. It belonged to someone much closer. Someone who was still alive. Someone who had been watching both of you from the beginning. And when the phone rang moments later, they looked at the unknown number on the screen and realized the past was no longer sitting quietly inside an old box. It was calling them. The phone continued ringing. For a moment, they simply stared at the screen. The unknown number seemed to carry the weight of every unanswered question they had spent the last few days trying to understand. Part of them wanted to ignore it. Another part knew that running from the truth was exactly how this entire story had survived for so long. They answered. Neither person spoke immediately. Then an older voice said quietly, "You found the papers." Their heart tightened. So you know what happened? A long silence followed. Yes, the voice finally answered. I have known for years. The words landed harder than any accusation could have. The caller explained that the original family conflict had begun with a betrayal involving money, trust, and a decision that destroyed relationships. When the truth threatened to come into the open, someone invented the story of a family curse to redirect everyone's attention. Over time, the lie became tradition. Children were warned about it. Relatives repeated it. And eventually, people began treating one another as though an invisible force had marked them. But there had never been a curse. There had only been fear. Fear passed from one generation to another. The person listening closed their eyes. So why did you let me believe it? The answer came softly. Because I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you would hate us. That sentence revealed the final wound. The person who had turned against you had not been acting from hatred. They had been carrying inherited fear, family pressure, and an old story they had never been brave enough to challenge. But understanding the reason did not erase the damage. They knew that now. They also knew something else. You deserved an apology that did not contain excuses. So they went to see you. When they finally stood face to face, neither of you spoke at first. There was no dramatic confrontation. No angry speech. Only two people standing in the same room with everything that had been left unsaid between them. They looked at you and said, I believed something about you without giving you the chance to tell me who you were. You remained silent. They continued. I let someone else's fear become my judgment. And you paid the price for it. Their voice broke slightly. I am sorry. For the first time, they were not trying to defend themselves. They were simply telling the truth. And sometimes the most powerful apology is not the one that explains everything. It is the one that finally stops explaining and takes responsibility. You looked down for a moment. Then you asked the question they had been dreading. Why didn't you ask me? They had no perfect answer. Because asking would have required trust. And trusting you would have meant questioning the people who had shaped their understanding of the world. They admitted that. I was scared that you would prove them right. You slowly looked back at them. And now? They took a breath. Now I'm scared of becoming like them. Something softened in the room. Not because the past had disappeared. Not because everything was magically repaired. But because the truth had finally been spoken without disguise. That was the beginning of healing. Not the ending. The two of you eventually went through the documents together. The original record confirmed what the old letter had suggested. The supposed curse had been deliberately created to hide a betrayal. The people who suffered afterward were not victims of supernatural punishment. They were victims of a family culture built around secrecy, suspicion, and unresolved pain. And there was another discovery. The person who had originally created the story had eventually confessed privately before passing away. The confession had been hidden because the family feared humiliation. That secret had lasted longer than the person who created it. But secrets do not become truth simply because they survive for a long time. Eventually, someone has to decide that the silence ends here. And this time, that person was you. You did not choose revenge. You did not demand that everyone suffer because you had suffered. You chose something harder. You chose to tell the truth without becoming consumed by it. The person who had once turned against you watched that decision with a mixture of regret and admiration. They finally understood what they had failed to see before. You were not carrying a curse. You were carrying a history. And history is not destiny. A painful past can explain someone without defining them. A family mistake can be acknowledged without being inherited. A broken pattern can end with one person deciding not to repeat it. That realization changed both of you. The relationship did not return instantly to the way it had been. There were still conversations to have. Trust had to be rebuilt through consistency. Some wounds needed time rather than promises. But something important had returned. Choice. You were no longer trapped inside the story other people had written for you. And neither were they. Months later, the old photographs were still there. The letters were still there. The documents were still there. But they no longer carried the same power. They had become evidence of something that was finished. Not a curse. A cycle. And cycles can end. One evening, the person who had once feared being connected to you sat quietly beside you. The sun was disappearing beyond the horizon, leaving the room filled with soft golden light. They looked at you and said, "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing everything because of a story that wasn't even true?" You smiled gently. "Sometimes. What do you think now?" You looked toward the fading light. "I think people can inherit fear without realizing they have a choice." They nodded. "And what about us?" You turned toward them. "We get to choose differently." That was the moment the story finally became bigger than the family secret. Because the greatest discovery had never been who created the lie. It was discovering that neither of you had to live according to it. The person who had turned against you learned that love should not be judged by rumors. You learned that someone else's fear does not determine your worth. And both of you learned that truth does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives as a letter. Sometimes as a difficult conversation. Sometimes as the courage to ask one question nobody else wanted asked. And sometimes, truth arrives when a person finally looks at someone they pushed away and realizes, "I should have listened to your heart before I listened to their fear." If you have ever been misunderstood because of something connected to your past, remember this. You are not obligated to become the worst thing that ever happened in your family. You are not required to carry another person's shame. You do not have to keep repeating a pattern simply because generations before you did. And you do not have to prove your innocence to everyone who has already decided who you are. Your life is still being written. The old chapter may explain some of your scars, but it does not own the next page. So tonight, let the fear that was handed to you stop with you. Let honesty replace suspicion. Let wisdom replace inherited anxiety. Let forgiveness have boundaries, but let it also have room for transformation. And if someone walked away from you because they believed something untrue, do not spend your entire life chasing them to prove your worth. Let truth speak through the life you live. Let your character become louder than rumors. Let your peace become evidence that you survived what was supposed to define you. May you be given the courage to question what no longer serves you. May you have wisdom to recognize the difference between genuine warning and inherited fear. May old family patterns lose their power over your future. May the relationships meant to remain in your life be strengthened by honesty, patience, and understanding. And may every false story spoken about you eventually lose its ability to control how you see yourself. Most of all, may you remember that your beginning does not have to determine your ending. The story you inherited is not necessarily the story you must continue. You can be the person who chooses truth. You can be the person who chooses healing. You can be the person who closes the door on an old cycle and opens another one for everyone who comes after you. And perhaps that was the greatest revelation of all. There was never a curse waiting for you. There was only a pattern waiting for someone brave enough to break it. And you were never meant to fear your own story. You were meant to rewrite it. If this fictional story spoke to something deep inside you, stay connected to this channel for more inspirational stories about faith, healing, relationships, and second chances. Share this message with someone who may need the reminder that their past does not have to become their future. And before you leave, take one quiet moment for yourself. Breathe. Release what was never yours to carry. And step forward knowing that a painful chapter can end without taking your hope with it. Your story is still unfolding. And the next page does not have to look anything like the last one.